We are so thrilled to have all of you with us today to hear our talk with Ms. Pamela Rotner Sakamoto, the author of Midnight in Broad Daylight. We started this series earlier this year, and it's an opportunity for us to invite authors from across the state and the nation to come on and give us a little bit more of a backstory behind the novels that they have written. So again, we're just honored to have all of you with us today. For those of you who are new, we love taking questions. So be sure to just write your question in that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen, and we will get to as many as possible. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do the programs that we do without the amazing support of all of you, as well as our sponsors. So please take a moment to check out these corporate sponsors and mahalo them this holiday season. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Ms. Pamela Rotner Sakamoto is a writer, historian, and teacher. She is the author of 2 books, Midnight in Broad Daylight and Japanese Diplomats and Jewish Refugees. Both books concern Japan. Midnight in Broad Daylight is a narrative nonfiction story of a Japanese-American family divided by war, with brothers in opposing armies and the tragedy of the atomic bomb. It has been translated into Japanese as well as Chinese for both the Taiwanese and mainland China readers. Pamela has worked off-site for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and as an expert consultant on Japan for more than 20 years, and she lived in Japan for 17 years. She presently chairs the Academy Social Studies Department at Punahou School, where she teaches European history, Asian history, and bias studies. Please help me give a very warm virtual Maui welcome to Pamela Rotner Sakamoto. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm delighted to be here. I'm in my office at Punahou because I have better Wi-Fi here.
You know, Wi-Fi is such, reliable Wi-Fi is so important nowadays, especially with the Zoom culture. So thank you. You have a beautiful office. I love your Kokeshi doll right behind you there. And yeah, thank you for being with us. I want to just start off talking a little bit more about you. You are a fellow East Coaster. You studied at Amherst. You were drawn to Japan, where you ended up living for 17 years and then coming upon this story. But can you kind of fill in the blanks for us? Let us know a little bit more about who you are.
Oh, thank you. Well, I come from, I guess, a place of inadequacy, I have to say. I started studying Japanese at Amherst when I was a sophomore because I knew nothing about Japan. This was the mid-'80s, and Japan was the world's #2 economy. Japan was just booming. The United States was looking to imitate Japan. With its Ministry of Industry and Technology, it just seemed as if Japan was an unstoppable force. And while I wasn't particularly interested in the economics, I was really drawn to the cultural aspect and the art and even the cuisine, with which I had no experience as well. I didn't even know how to use chopsticks. This was a different moment in time growing up in a lily white community on the East Coast. And so I felt that I would like to study Japanese. There was a great professor at Amherst, and sometimes it's just a single person who can change your life. And I felt that if I tried out the language, that it would be a window into the culture, and that the culture was fascinating, and I wanted to know more about this really important place. And so I started to study Japanese, and one thing led to another. And I ended up going to Japan after I graduated from college on a fellowship, and then ended up staying. I originally went for 1 year, and 1 year led to another. And before I knew it, I was immersed, and I I consider myself a student of Japan and will be for the rest of my life. So a little bit there.
Nice, nice. Yes, there's something very special about Japan, and I understand what you're saying. So this, of course, as we said in your bio, this isn't your first book. Midnight in Broad Daylight is not your first book. Your first book was Japanese Diplomats and Jewish Refugees, the story that included Sugihara Chihune. Um, and it was at a press conference for that book that you actually ended up meeting the main person of Midnight in Broad Daylight, Harry Fukuhara. But that was also, very much by chance. I think you were talking to someone there about, the stories of these individuals, how amazing they were. And the person said, if you think these stories are amazing, you should also talk to Harry. So tell us a little bit about that, what year it was, and how that relationship blossomed.
Okay, so that encounter with Harry, who was a complete stranger to me, happened in 1994 at this press conference. I was married to a Japanese at this point, and we had been living in Canada for his post business posting and had moved back to Tokyo in 1994. And I was working on my dissertation, and I was investigating the circumstances surrounding Sugihara's rescue of 2,000 Polish Jews during World War II. And somehow I ended up on this mailing list, and I have no idea how. It's one of those little inexplicable mysteries that notified me that there was going to be this press conference to welcome these former Jewish refugees who had received visas from Sugihara in 1940 in Lithuania. And they had ultimately been saved by him because of these visas. And they had traveled to Japan in 1940 and ultimately immigrated or emigrated to the United States and Canada and Israel. And their lives were miraculous because of this. And they had lost most of their family members to the Holocaust. And they were coming back to Japan in 1994 for the first time since 1940. And it was a very emotional reunion. And I thought, wow, I've been looking at all of these documents in Japanese at the Foreign Ministry's archives in Tokyo to understand the circumstances in which this single lone diplomat had rescued all of these refugees with visas. I can now meet some of these former refugees. Won't this be amazing? So I was going to meet them, and I never expected to meet anyone else. In fact, I thought I would be happy if I could just be a fly on the wall at this press conference and glean some sense of these refugees and maybe get a chance to say hello, but really nothing more. And while I was there, I saw this gentleman, and it was Harry, and he was so extraordinarily bilingual. Deirdre, I think you are bilingual, but it's so hard to really achieve native fluency in both English and Japanese. You can try for a lifetime. And this was somebody who was switching back and forth between the two languages with such confidence and ability. And I was struck by him. And now I think back and I think Harry had an aura. And it was this aura of confidence and dignity and utmost ability and warmth and sparkle. You know, he was a funny guy. And while he could be very stern when the moment called for it, he also had this wicked sense of humor. And he employed it when he wanted. And I was taken by him, but I knew nothing about him until I did say to that young filmmaker, at this after this press conference, wow, these former refugees stories are so mind-boggling and amazing. And she looked at me and said, if you think their stories are amazing, you should talk to Harry. And Harry brought up his own story with me. I ended up not only going to this conference, but also traveling with this group as they went to Sugihara's birthplace and different places in Japan. And Harry slowly told me his story. And then he kept in touch with me. He was living in San Jose. He was retired from the US Army. And he would come back to Tokyo to see friends, still conduct business for the Pentagon, and just see his family. And he would always call me for lunch. And for 4 years, we had lunch together every few months. And that led to ultimately to doing this book.
What a lovely memory. And the thing of it is, I'm going to share the screen here so that our viewers know who Harry Fukuhara was. Um, if you can see the screen there, the gentleman with the glasses is Harry, and he was one of the top linguists in the military intelligence service. We use this photograph a lot whenever we do our MIS exhibits here at the center. But you know, the, we all know that the military intelligence service, they didn't even talk about what they did until the 2000s, and even then, some of them didn't. For him to confide this story to you, what a huge responsibility to you, but also what an honor for him to entrust this story of his family uh, to you. That's amazing.
I feel so fortunate. I mean, forever fortunate that he trusted me. And it occurred to me much later that we talked for so long, I mean, years before I approached him and said, Harry, have you ever considered leaving a formal record of this story? I mean, on a family level, your family doesn't even know the dimensions of this story yet. On a level for the Japanese American community, there are other people who may share it and would appreciate knowing it. And really, for US Japan relations, this is a remarkable story in which many Japanese Americans, we know that there were 6,000 in the MIS during and after the war, served as important bridges between the United States and Japan. And Harry is one of those, but there are many others. And Harry would be the first to agree with that he was just one linguist. He was just one lieutenant early in his career, and that there were others who were playing instrumental roles. And in fact, I believe that the US Japan relationship, the alliance, is so strong today because of that early involvement during the war and after the war with the Japanese American community, seamlessly bridging the differences. So Harry agreed immediately. I think he was waiting for me to suggest it. Literally, he introduced me to Pierce and Frank, his younger brothers, right after that, and we started working on the story. But he did trust me, and I wonder if his military intelligence background meant that he was vetting me all those years and I was oblivious. I just
Over cheeseburgers and iced tea
exactly
at the hotel.
knew
Um,
somehow, and then, I just thought it was interesting always to meet him. I didn't know where it would go. But I, by the time we talked about doing a book, and I said to him, I have no idea when and whether it will be published, but I will try. He did trust me, and I am so grateful to his entire family for that.
So, for I think most of the people on our Zoom call today have either read the book, they're in the process of reading the book, but for those who maybe haven't read it, can you give good luck? Can you give a synopsis of this amazing book, which I have to say, just a Japanese American family caught between two worlds doesn't even give it justice. I mean, there are worlds within worlds of each of these family members. But give us a little 101 about the backstory of the book.
So you did a lovely job introducing it, in which you said that it's a story of a family divided by war, and this is a story in which the parents of Harry are Japanese immigrants to the Seattle area, coming in with the great wave of immigration. The father went to the United States to work on the railroads from Hiroshima Prefecture. Very common story at the time in the early 1900s. His picture bride Harry's mom followed. Again, very typical story. And they had 5 American born kids. And they sent 2 of those children back to Japan, to Hiroshima, to live with relatives for their education, which was also a common tendency in the 1920s and 30s. And then the father dies of pleurisy very unexpectedly, and the mom, Kinu, has to take her family back to Japan in order to survive financially and have the support of her siblings. And she takes her 5 American born children. The 2 who were in Japan have been back in the US for a few years, but she takes the whole group back to Japan. And 2 ultimately go back to the US. So there's all of this trans-Pacific detail. And the 2 who are in the US are Mary, the only daughter, and Harry, the middle son. And Harry is the one whom I had met and had risen ultimately to be one of the first Japanese American colonels in the US Army. So by the time that Harry and Mary are in the United States, it's the late 1930s. We're looking and then at the outbreak of war with Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And within a few months, Harry and Mary are interned, sent to Tulare, a county fairgrounds in California from Los Angeles, and ultimately to Gila River, a concentration camp in Arizona. Meanwhile, the rest of the family is in Hiroshima. The mom, Victor, the eldest son, and Pierce and Frank, the younger brothers. And Harry ends up volunteering for the military intelligence service from Gila River and is sent to the Southwest Pacific. And he crisscrosses and island hops the Southwest Pacific, all the while knowing that his brothers are of age to be conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army. And by summer of 1945, Harry is in the Philippines facing the prospect of landing on Kyushu, the southern island of Japan, if a major invasion will take place on November 1st, 1945, as slated. Meanwhile, his younger brothers, Pierce and Frank, are on Kyushu as well, preparing for the expected invasion by the Americans. And everything changes when the atomic bombs are detonated above Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. But of course, the mom, Kinu, and the eldest brother, Victor, are in the city, and they are deeply affected. Harry reunites with his family. I won't tell you, I won't give any spoilers, although many of you have read the book. And it is the happiest moment of his life, but the story doesn't end there. And it is ultimately a story of love and resilience and tragedy and loss and enduring affection. So it is uplifting, but there are experiences in there that many of us cannot imagine.
Yeah, yeah. Some of them are just so heart-wrenching, and right when you think you know what is going to happen, like Mary is going to take over her aunt's, sweet shop, and then that doesn't happen, and it's so real and so raw. But let's talk about the women a little bit in the book. All 3 women, Kinu, the mother, Aunt Kanu, and then the daughter of Kinu, Mary, are just so strong. And I think often Westerners have a tendency to think that Japanese women might be subservient or uh, not strong because of
Because
their
of their
quiet
quiet.
and their softness. But there is such a quiet strength to the Japanese women. And you look at Kinu, the mother, holding fast, not giving up her lifestyle in Hiroshima later on, going to see her sons. But let's talk about the women a little bit. And did any one woman stand out to you or have more of an effect on you?
Oh, great. No, I admire the women as well. I mean, can you imagine Kinu never really knowing what her husband's professional life was because he kept his professional and private separate. And then within a matter of months, she becomes a widow with 5 children, right? And the level of worry that she must have had, and very tightened finances because of the depression. And she makes this decision to go back to Japan, where she hasn't lived for many years. And her own children have various degrees of acquiescence. Harry, a troublemaker at 13 and a typical American boy, fights his mother every step of the way. And yet she never blames anybody. She never strikes out in anger. She is a symbol of forbearance, and she takes the family back to Japan and then endures the war years. I mean, we don't learn much in the US what the Japanese home front was like, but it was a terrible place where Japanese civilians were really sacrificing their own health and livelihoods for the sake of the war. And the war was being run by the military. They were innocent victims in many ways. So she's remarkable. Kyo was a force of nature, the founder of this elegant sweet shop that people in Hiroshima still remember today. It was ultimately eliminated by the atomic bomb. It was mere rubble after that, but the memory lingers. She today would have been the founder of a startup. She was a woman from a different time. She was force of nature, imperious, generous to a fault, uh, not particularly maternal, even while caring for her sister's children, but loving nevertheless, adoring towards her sister Kinu, a complex, rich character. Mary, oh, I loved Mary, and I had the privilege of meeting her in the Los Angeles area and interviewing her a few times. And, she was somebody who was tossed by circumstances beyond her control, sent to Japan when she was young, felt abandoned by her family because she had thought she was going for a visit, but was deposited with relatives to learn Japanese and go to school there. Went back to the United States as a teenager, and today we have ESL and all kinds of resources in our schools, but Mary was assigned to elementary school as a teenager because her English had suffered while she was in Japan. She never felt as if she was good enough in either language, but of course she was bilingual. She goes back to Japan when Kinu takes everybody back and suffers through that. And then, as a lone single woman, moves back to the US and tries to make it on her own. And she had so many problems with her marriage, and even the second marriage was difficult that she had. And she ends up in Gila River with a small child with Harry, and she always endures. And her children would tell me that she never complained either. And she was funny and elegant and resourceful and complex from the beginning to the end, much like her Aunt Kyo, and troubled by her own relationship with her mother that was never resolved. Circumstances beyond this family's control played havoc with their fates, and they did the best they could under those circumstances.
How wonderful that you actually had the opportunity to speak with her, and I know you stay in touch with her daughter, and that's great. Um, Going back to Harry, you talk about how he was so, very effervescent and sparkly. And there is the one passage in the book, and I think you're going to read it for us, where his compassion just shone through. To me, it made a really big impression on me. It was where he meets up with he has this nemesis when he's in Hiroshima, a young fellow by the name of Matsuura. And I'll turn it over to you, but I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that and the fact that you spoke to both Matsuda and Harry about this story. But would you do that for us and give us a little reading?
Oh, thank you so much. Sure. No, so when Harry was in Japan in the mid 1930s, as that 13-year-old, he stayed until he was 18 and graduated high school and then returned to the US. You know, he was learning Japanese. He had some, but not enough. And he moved and talked and gestured like an American. And he grew up in Hiroshima in this Japanese neighborhood. And this local tough named Matsuura really resented this, in his eyes, American guy who looked really confident and in Matsuura's eyes was swaggering down the street. In Harry's own eyes, he was just walking down the street. He didn't mean to attract anybody's particular attention. But for Matsuura, this guy was showing off. And so you see this divide between a native Japanese, a particularly tough local bully, and by his own account, by the way, and a Japanese American who was living in his ancestral city, but wasn't particularly Japanese. So I will read a bit about that because what happens during the war is that Matsuda volunteers for the Japanese Imperial Army very early, sent to China, and ultimately during the Pacific War ends up in New Guinea. And he's a master sergeant by this point, you know, in charge of a lot of men. He's seen a lot of action, and he's as tough as can be, even tougher than before. And Harry is in 1944, where we'll jump cut to, is a master linguist. And he's confident too. But he has been in the Pacific for some time, and he takes on his linguistic job, which is basically interrogating Japanese prisoners of war for any tactical information. He takes it on as a pro. He's not particularly afraid at this point of being near the front. He's not particularly intimidated by the prospect of interviewing any POWs. Basically, he has a routine, and then everything changes. So this is where I'll start from. That same morning, June 3rd, 1944, Harry strode into another clearing where a few prisoners at a time were being brought in. All told, he would interview 6 men. Under tents or in the open, lashed by whipping rain, Harry conducted individual interrogations that lasted about 30 minutes, depending on the value of the intelligence. Very few good soldiers came in as prisoners, Harry said, certain that this day would be no different from all the others. Most enlisted men simply followed orders. They didn't have any idea who was winning or losing the war. Many hadn't wanted to surrender, but were too physically compromised to resist. Those who had become separated from their units, had little information of tactical worth. When Harry heard that 2 more POWs were being brought in, and one was a little belligerent, even cocky, he didn't blink. He would elicit what he could, yet he admitted that he was intrigued by the drama of their capture. The stragglers had been combative when they were caught floating down the river on logs, which was very unusual. Transported on a stretcher by military police to an area swarming with the enemy, the man from Hiroshima saw from afar a man in an American uniform with Japanese features. Even in his own diminished state, he kept his wits about him. He never forgot a face. Masaka, no way. Surely I have seen this person before. He pointed and asked his interrogator who the man was. The linguist standing over the stretcher was startled. Generally, prisoners didn't ask questions. When they did, it was usually, "Are you Japanese?" Captives wondered whether their interrogators were former Japanese prisoners who, unable to return home without bringing shame upon their families, had switched sides and allegiances. Harry's counterpart was not about to reveal Harry's name to the prisoner. Those were his orders. The linguist yelled for Harry to come over. Harry approached the POW and saw a lanky skeletal man with a scruffy beard that reached his chest. He reeked of perspiration, filth, and urine. The prisoner's eyes were hard, challenging, unblinking. Most would have averted them in such a compromised situation. He was ill, Harry gathered, but his spirit was not broken. No sooner had Harry sized up the POW than the man spoke, his voice gravelly, his words brazen. I went to Koryo and you went to Sanyo, he said. Do you have a cigarette? Taken aback, Harry said nothing. He looked at the prisoner's name on the white tag, similar to the one he had worn when he was first interned. Matsuda. Harry was stunned but betrayed no expression, although the man was an emaciated specter of the bully he remembered. The dark, sloping eyes and the grin, thin-lipped mouth were the same. Are you that, Matsuda? He said. Hi, yes. Harry's nemesis from Hiroshima, with whom he had once tussled at the night market, with whom he had eyed warily from across the street every day on his way to school, whom Harry had thought he had seen the last of 6 years earlier when that local tough boarded a military transport for China. Yet here he was, Matsuda, a seasoned soldier and an adversary. Harry had little time to talk, especially since his colleague had already started the interrogation and he was the one to finish. He handed Matsuda a cigarette and left. But later that day, he searched out the POW, gave him a can of American beef and a helping of Japanese rice. Harry would not deny their roots, however tangled. Matsuda lasted the night. In the morning, Harry stopped by the pit where he was captive and explained that Matsuda would be transported to Australia for medical treatment. Loaded on an amphibious vehicle, Matsuda was taken to Wakdi and placed on a plane. When the plane took off from the coral-crushed runway and banked over the lush mountains, Matsuda, who had never flown before, was convinced that he would be pushed out and killed. Nevertheless, he arrived in Australia unscathed. While recuperating in an immaculate hospital, he began to view his encounter with Harry through a sepia tint. It was auspicious luck, he said. When you fight while young, you remember well. If he and Fukuhara had not grappled at the festival in Hiroshima, he might not have recognized him in New Guinea. Fighting brings intimacy, he reflected. By giving him special treatment and dispatching him promptly to Australia, Harry had saved his life. Meanwhile, Harry lay awake at night, listening for the on the prowl, the crunch of dead leaves, the crack of split branches, a grunt in Japanese. Against all odds, he had come face to face with an enemy he knew. He knew now what he hadn't wanted to admit. There was the chance that I might run across someone else, he said, a friend or relative, even a brother. But he kept the encounter to himself, lest the news spread of his ties to Japan and raise suspicions about his loyalty to the United States. Harry told a friend only that he had run into an acquaintance from Hiroshima. He said nothing about his family still living there. I'll stop there.
Just so emotional. What a story. It's almost one of those things that is, you think is made up, you know, but it's not. And what struck me was Harry's compassion and ability to put everything aside, you know, during this war, all of the horrible violence that's happening, and you know, take care of this individual who they meet up again years later.
No, it's so true. I mean, Harry could have turned his back on Matsuda because, Harry couldn't help but think of his brothers, and he was in denial that he might not meet them. I mean, he kept blocking out that possibility that he might come up against someone he knew at war, including his brothers. And he hated Matsuda. Matsuda had made his life miserable, but by this point, Harry was a mature young man in his 20s. He was no longer a teenager. He knew this man when they were boys. They shared that Hiroshima neighborhood by this point. And Harry did have compassion, extraordinary compassion. He had been interned, he had suffered himself. He knew that people were doing always the best they could under straitened circumstances. And he reached out, and Matsuda responded to that goodness for the rest of his life. He would say that Harry saved his life. Harry would say in response to me, no, I just gave him equal care. Today, it would be an exercise in equity when we talk about equity and inclusion. But Harry said, no, I didn't do anything special. But in Matsuda's eyes, bringing him that canned beef and that rice, and then looking after him, making sure that he was sent out on the first plane to Australia, he felt that he could have been disregarded as a POW or killed. And in fact, there were many incidents of killings of POWs on both sides. And we don't know what would have happened to him otherwise if Harry hadn't looked after him.
Yeah. So, I have to ask, how did writing this story affect your life? And you have two children who have been raised biculturally. Um, Writing this must have had an effect on the entire family. Do you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, I was so inspired by Harry. I mean, I came, as you all know now, to a study of Japan without having a background. And by the time I met Harry, I was a student of Japanese, and I could do the research and interviews in both languages, albeit with my American accent. But I I was so drawn to how he had taken really terrible circumstances, losing a father at a young age, poverty when he was back in the United States, never fitting into Japan, suffering from that undercurrent of prejudice towards Japanese Americans in the US as well, that then becomes so overt after Pearl Harbor, being interned, volunteering for the US Army while he's incarcerated by the American government, crisscrossing the Pacific with white officers as his superiors, and nevertheless never resenting that when he was the most capable among them. And always being bright, always being optimistic, always being analytical and clear thinking, but taking the hopeful side. And so he expanded my vision of how a person could be, no matter the circumstances. And I was raising my children who were born in Tokyo, Hapa kids, half Japanese, half Caucasian, in Japan through their elementary school years. And I could see my own son in 20th century Tokyo, 21st century Tokyo, Hapa boy experiencing a little bit of what Harry went through. Like if Harry wore the wrong color t-shirt or Frank wore the wrong color t-shirt in Hiroshima, the neighborhood bullies, including Matsuda, would call them out on that. And here's my son growing up in one of the world's most cosmopolitan cities, and yet a Japanese neighborhood, and going to Japanese school. And he would be called out. You smile too much. Your gestures are too big. You're American. And yet, he's a dual citizen with native Japanese. And I would think of the stories that Harry and his younger brother Frank told me, and I would say, ooh, some things, the more they change, the more they stay the same. And yet I knew from Harry and Frank's example that they could take these formative, difficult experiences and turn them around, make the most of them. And that's what I wanted my children to do too. And I hope that informed their lives. They did know Harry and Frank and the other members of the family. And that was a gift for them too.
I'm quite sure that the book was picked up by a publisher right away. Um, how
You're
long did
so
it?
mistaken.
So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, so it took you how long to write the book, and then how long did it take to get picked up?
A long time for both. I'm embarrassed, but so I met Harry in 1994, and it was by late 1998 that I really 1999 that I started to work on the story, and I was trying to corroborate everything in both English and Japanese with documents and newspaper articles and files, government files and interviews on in both places and in both languages. So it's a big story. It's an epic saga, and it really runs the course of a century from the time that Harry's father emigrated to the United States to very close to the present. And I had several agents along the way, but the book was not published until January 2016, and I endured a lot of rejection for the book. Some of it was my fault. I still feel that I needed to work on the story because I was very intent about writing narrative nonfiction. I wanted it to tell a true story in a way that was not a textbook history, in a way that a reader could hopefully fall into it and be immersed with the characters' developments. Uh, I needed to learn that skill, but some of it really was agents and publishers saying to me from mainstream presses, this is a great story, but we don't know what the market is. We think that the market is the Japanese American community, and that's tiny. And I'd already written an academic book, the one on Japanese diplomats and Jewish refugees, and I wanted this story to reach a larger audience because academic books are designed for university libraries, for scholars. And I wanted this book to be available to somebody who knew nothing about Japan, but was intrigued, or knew a lot about Japan and was still intrigued. And so I just wanted it to be distributed widely. So I needed to accommodate that market, and I couldn't convince them that it was for me a great big American story, a timeless story. From the beginning, I really believed, and to this day, that you substitute, with the exception of the atomic bomb, which is a unique circumstance, if you were to substitute Iraqi American brothers or Afghani American brothers or almost any ethnicity, because we represent so many in the United States, you could have this story of brothers or sisters or siblings divided by conflict. And what do they do to bridge those differences and survive that and come back stronger than before? So I was willing to persist. And my greatest sadness was that Harry knew that the book was going to be published, but it wasn't in his hands before he died. The cover was just about to become available when he passed. But my greatest joy is that it was published, and that the readership that Harry hoped would happen, as well as what I hoped has occurred.
Oh, we're very glad. We're very, very glad too. Tell us a little bit about how you chose the title Midnight in Broad Daylight.
I had so many titles in mind. This is kind of secret information, right? And I, I think I first submitted the title was Enemy Citizens, and I thought it embodied both of these qualities that the boys on both sides of the Pacific and the family experienced. And I don't know, I liked it, but it didn't go over very well with the publisher and then, or with the agents. And then I had for a very long time Sunrise over Hiroshima. And I was like, oh, this kind of captures the concept of the rising sun with Japan's flag and identity. And then it captures Harry arriving in Hiroshima in mid-October 1945 as a young American Army officer trying to find his family in the wake of the atomic bomb. And he reaches the city on his third attempt at sunrise. It's so beautiful. And I loved that title. And I remember when HarperCollins and my wonderful editor there, signed on, my editor said to me, at the very beginning, she's like, I'm not sure about the title. And it was very matter of the fact. And I thought, oh, okay. And she said, we'll talk about it. And so I didn't say anything for the longest time. And we worked together really smoothly. And everything went according to plan with that particular schedule. It was up until that point that seemed to have taken forever. And then towards the end, she said, I'm not sure about the title. So I started sending her titles, and sometimes she would reply with maybe, and sometimes she wouldn't reply at all, which I knew was like no interest whatsoever. And I was reading poetry and thinking of all these beautiful symbolic Japanese titles. And then one day I was reading some Japanese poetry, poems about the atomic bomb. And in fact, I'm looking at some of my words now. And I read this one, but that was in Japanese, and then the English translation was about the moment of the atomic bomb, midnight in broad daylight. And immediately I knew, and I thought, wow, this not only captures the detonation of the bomb that Harry's mother Kinu and Aunt Kyo and brother Victor experienced, as well as others, family members, but also midnight in broad daylight was Harry's experience because he really identified as an American. And when he was interned, he was shocked that his own government would do this. And it was as if the rug was pulled out from under him in broad daylight. And it was the darkest period of his life. It was much darker than the war itself. And he persevered nevertheless. So that's what it meant for me. But readers write to me and it means different things for them. And I think that's terrific too.
Thank you for sharing that. You touched on it just a moment ago about Harry's return to Hiroshima as an American officer, and can you do that reading from the book where he comes home? We know we didn't get a chance to talk about all of his brothers, but that would be lovely if you could do that.
Sure. So on Harry's third attempt, and he assumes up until this point that his family has died because the news coming out of Hiroshima is so bleak, including that anything that did survive, like the remnant of a plant or root, will take 75 years to really grow back. And of course, they just didn't have the scientific knowledge yet. So he is already filled with a lot of survivor's guilt. He feels almost as if he has detonated the bomb himself and annihilated the city. But he can't resist when he is posted to Kobe, the temptation to try to get to the city himself. And he goes with a young Howley driver. And by this point, he's an officer and he reaches Hiroshima. So here we go. At Hiroshima Station, Harry stepped down from the Jeep. The imposing reinforced concrete landmark was a flame-singed, cracked shell, missing windows, ceilings, and floor. Harry could see several unrestricted miles across the city. Only a few ruins broke the flattened vista. All was eerie and lifeless, he later wrote. There was no movement or noise. The only things that appeared undamaged were streetcar tracks and gravestones near where Buddhist temples once stood. His chest, heavy with emotion, Harry believed it was unlikely that the house in Takasu stood untouched. Takasu is the Hiroshima suburb where his mother lives. He spied two men sitting around a bonfire in a streetcar that had been flung from its tracks, landing upright, surrounded by debris. Where, he asked, could they cross the river en route to Takasu? The men, who appeared drunk and reeked of alcohol, did not bother to look up. Light from the flames flickered across their faces. Zombies, Harry thought. Ultimately, his driver Chester and he would need several hours for what should have taken at most one to get to Takasu. As they approached, the sun was rising. Their journey from Kobe had consumed nearly a day. The gracious town of Takasu appeared caught in an unearthly slumber. At least Harry expected to hear a dog barking in response to the chief's roar, but there was not a living thing in sight. Later, he would hear that during the war, domesticated animals had either starved or been eaten. In a daze, he motioned Chester to stop in front of his mother's house, where he had lived for a few months back in 1938. The hedges at the entrance were charred. The house sat at a slight tilt, and its roof appeared ripped. Harry paused before going to the door. The window on the front door was missing every pane of glass. Inside, Kinu and Kyo, who happened to be visiting, had been sleeping in a tatami room on the first floor when they were startled by the sound of the Jeep and watched in horror as it cranked to a stop. Thinking that the house was about to be plundered by enemy forces, they had fled upstairs to hide. They had heard rumors of rape, even of old women. With Chester standing beside him, Harry knocked and waited. At last, the door opened, and there stood the two sisters. If Harry had not known the women, he would not have recognized them. So emaciated, ill, and aged did they appear. What was worse, his mother and aunt met Harry with blank stares. Kino looked up at Chester and down at Harry, back and forth, over again. Harry knew his skin was jaundiced from the side effects of the anti-malarial medication, but he had anticipated a flash of recognition. There was none. All they saw was an American soldier, he thought. The women seemed frightened. Finally, Kinu's eyes met Harry's, and he took a deep breath. "Oka-san, Katsuharu desu. Tadaima kaite mairimashita," he said, using polite, humble language and his Japanese middle name. "Mother, I am Katsuharu. I have come home." Kino blinked. No one said a word. At last, Kyo recognized her nephew and cried out, "Harry!" Probably more like, "Hari." Kina's eyes filled with tears, and silently she opened her arms. The years and distance disappeared as Kino and Harry held on to one another. When they separated, Kino struggled to gather her wits. Harry's uniform and pistol had thrown her off. He was supposed to be in the US. She had no idea that he had enlisted. "What are you doing here?" Had he run away from somewhere? He must hide the Jeep. Why would she say something like that, Harry wondered, concealing the Jeep. For the first time in more than 7 years, he went inside his mother's house. There in the foyer was the Art Deco ceiling lamp and mirrored hat stand that used to hold his dad's fedora. Kino told him that his older brother, Victor, was on the second floor. Climbing the stairs, Harry noticed shards of glass embedded in the stucco walls. He opened the sliding door to his brother's room and was overwhelmed by the odor of sweat, dried blood, and pus. Victor lay prone on a futon. There was hardly any skin on his back. Victor did not recognize him at first, but when Harry spoke, his brother looked him in the eyes. Couldn't talk much, Harry remembered, but he smiled and listened. Harry kept his eyes on Victor's face. He did not fully register that Victor was suffering from severe burns. Victor responded kindly, trying after all these years and tribulations to make conversation. They talked for a few minutes. Victor never said a word about his wounds. I'll stop there. Harry goes on to find his brother Pierce at a naval base in Frank, and that's a warm reunion, and the story continues.
Oh, thank you so very, very much. When we were talking about this earlier, you said something, I don't know if it was a mentor or told you this, if you cannot feel, you cannot write. And there's so much feeling in what you have written and these stories. And thank you so much for sharing them.
Thank you.
We are gently running out of time. I'm so sorry that we are, because I know we have love to talk to you more. I'm going to give a couple little housekeeping items and then come back to you, Pamela, for some closing remarks. To all of you, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us this entire year. It's been wonderful knowing that you are on the Zoom call with us. And we want to let you know that 2021, we have fresh new programming scheduled, but we also are going to continue the afternoon with the author on the third Saturday of the month. So a couple of you have been asking, and so we want to let you know, yes, we will continue doing it. January 16th, our author is actually a mother-daughter team, Carolyn Kubota Morinishi and Marianne Kurasaki Kubota, who've written a Japanese culture book for students. And it's a children's book, Japanese culture for kids, favorite children's stories. So they're all Japanese children's stories in English with language learning at the back of each of the stories. We're really excited about that. So again, that will be January 16th at 1:30. Please head to our website, nvmc.org, to sign up for future talks. And please know that this has been recorded. All of our talks are recorded, and you can find them on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel. So take a look at those and be sure to come back in 2021. So Pamela, again, thank you so much. I turn it back to you for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you. It's been such a privilege to spend time with you, Deirdre, and all of your audience out there. Thank you for giving up some of your precious afternoon on a holiday, during a holiday season. I'm so grateful to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center for this invitation. I don't know quite where to begin as I close, but I will say that I was especially drawn to this story because I didn't grow up in a place or at a moment in which I was exposed to what had happened to Japanese Americans during the internment. And when I did learn about it as an adult, I was ashamed that I didn't know more. And one of my hopes was with the story that more people would learn about it. Of course, many people in the audience know this intimately. And that was another reason why I was drawn to the story. Harry was very clear that his story was not unique, that there were other Japanese American families who had also experienced separation during the war, the anguish of that and loss, and he wanted to get it out there. So I'm so grateful to the Fukuharas, grateful to the Japanese American community for embracing this story, to you, Deirdre, and the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center for giving me an opportunity to talk about it. And I believe today, just as I did when I met Harry in 1994, that it's still a timeless story. You know, unfortunately, we're living in a period at this moment of heightened circumstances beyond our control with the pandemic. How will we rise to the occasion? And unfortunately, we're living at a moment of anti-Asian American sentiment in which our present president, Trump, has called the coronavirus the China virus. And that has been one of the reasons, among others, in which we've seen a surge of anti-Asian American assaults and harassment. And unfortunately, it can happen again. And I think that the Japanese American community has been very vigilant in this respect, both in the wake of 9/11 towards anti-Muslim American sentiment, supporting Muslim Americans, and is vigilant now. And we must all make sure that our better natures as Americans. Our inclusion, our treasure of diversity is that which survives, and that prejudice is mitigated and eliminated. And I hope that this story in some small way speaks to the great American spirit that Harry really represented, and his family. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I forgot to say that we don't have the book for sale at our center. However, if you have purchased the book, if you are purchasing the book, Pamela has very graciously agreed to send book plates. They're the little stickers that you can place inside your book with her autograph, signing your book, that you can then place inside the cover of your book. So if you are interested in receiving a book plate, email me. It's that email that sent you out the Zoom link, and we'll get it to Pamela. She will sign it and we'll get it back to you. But again, thank you. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for caring and your compassion, and for writing this story and being with us today, Pamela Rotner Sakamoto. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Ahui ho, everybody. Have a lovely holiday season, and we will see you in 2021. Mahalo.